Burial, burial, burial is my school. Best education reservoir for young learners just like me. Burial, burial.
Good afternoon, students at home. How are you doing? I hope you are fine and you are staying safe. Today we'll be taking on the second edition of our lesson on economics. As you can see on the board, the class for today is SS1 and the topic is limited liability companies. This limited liability companies is a subtopic of what we started with last week under the umbrella topic, business organizations. We started with sole proprietorship under business organizations. After that, we moved to partnership, and now today we'll be dealing with limited liability companies. Before we look at the meaning, types, features, advantages and disadvantages, I would like us to see what we have on the board as regards the meaning of limited liability companies. What is limited liability company? A limited liability company is a company in which the liability or burden of debt is limited to the amount of share capital the shareholders had agreed to contribute individually in the event of liquidation. Liquidation simply means dissolution. Dissolution means folding up, a business coming to an end. That is dissolution or liquidation. In this case, a shareholder cannot suffer the liability of the company up to his or her private property. Let me explain that definition on the board. It simply means that a limited liability company has limited responsibility for the shareholders. In other words, the consequence of the business folding up is limited to the number of shares the shareholder had contributed in the purchase of the ownership units of the business. Of course, you know that a company is usually owned by shareholders, unlike sole proprietorship, which is owned by the proprietor himself. But a limited liability company is different from sole proprietorship. A number of persons come together, contribute share capital in acquisition of the business, in setting up or acquiring an existing business. So their responsibility towards that business in the event of any loss or liquidation is limited only to the number of shares they had purchased in that business. So because a limited liability company is different from the owners, unlike the sole proprietorship, where the ownership of the business, where the business and the owner were one and the same. A limited liability company, on the other hand, there is that difference in identity. The identity of the business is separated from the identity of the owners. So if anything happens to the business, the shareholders only suffer what they contributed in the number of shares they had used in acquiring the business, the number of shares they had paid for. They are not liable to their properties. In other words, their personal properties cannot be used to settle debts that has gone down the drain with the business. So that is why the name limited liability comes in. Their responsibility is limited only to the number of shares they have in the company. I hope that is understood. Fine. Now we are going to look at types of limited liability companies. Types of limited liability companies. The first one is private limited liability company. And then the second one is public limited liability company. What is a private limited liability company? This is a company in which its articles is one of the documents that must be filed with the registrar of companies before the business is set up, in which its article states clearly that shareholders have no right to transfer their shares except they follow certain cumbersome procedures. And then it also limits the number of its shares, the number of its shareholders rather, from 2 to 50 persons, and prohibits any invitation of the public to subscribe to its shares. When you see all these things, know that that kind of company is a private limited liability company. Also, there is also the use of the word limited at the end of the name of the company. For example, if Liver Brothers were to be a private limited liability company, it will be Liver Brothers Nigeria Limited. Of course, there's an example here which says Bluebird Nigeria Limited. It's an existing company in Nigeria, Bluebird. So that's an example of a private limited liability company. The next type of limited liability company we'll be talking about is public limited liability company. This is one in which its articles allows the public to subscribe to its shares, must have a minimum of 7 persons and no limit to its maximum number, and allows its shares to be transferred. What that simply means is that a public limited liability company allows its shares to be sold to members of the public. Members of the public can easily become shareholders, can easily become co-owners of a public limited liability company simply by buying the shares that has been offered for sale to the public by the company. And then the membership must have a minimum of 7 persons. For a public limited liability company to be called public limited liability, a public limited liability company cannot be called public limited liability company if the number of persons are less than 7. But the maximum number of persons are not specified. In other words, it can be 10,000, it can be 100,000 persons. You can have shareholders as much as infinity. So these are some of the things that we look out for when we are trying to distinguish between private and public limited liability companies. And then the name of the company must always end with with the acronym PLC. PLC there, of course, simply means public limited company. I hope that is understood. An example of public limited companies in Nigeria are Zenith Bank Nigeria, Guinness Nigeria PLC, etc. Public limited liability companies are also popularly referred to as joint stock company. So joint stock company can be used interchangeably but with private limited liability company. So when you hear joint stock company and public limited liability company, know that they are the same thing. Okay, now that we know the meaning of public limited liability company, let us go ahead and look at the characteristics of these two types of companies, these two types of limited liability companies. We will start with the private limited liability companies. What are the features you will see and recognize that this is a private limited liability company? Number one, the company is owned by shareholders of between 2 to 50 persons. And then number two, the major aim of the business is to make profit, just like most businesses, starting from sole proprietorship, partnership, etc. Number three, the capital required to set up and run the business is provided by the shareholders in the form of shares. I had mentioned this earlier. Number four, the shareholders have limited liability, which I had also explained. Liability there simply means the responsibility the owners have towards the business. So I have said it here that in a limited liability company, that responsibility is limited only to the amount of shares that the shareholders had agreed to purchase. So at the end of the day, the property of that shareholder does not go in when the business liquidates, when the business folds up, when the business is dissolved. I hope I am clear on, I have made that point clear. Now, the business is a separate legal entity different from its owners. You can recall that when we were talking about sole proprietorship, we did say that sole proprietorship business has unlimited liability and that it is not a legal entity, which means the business and the owner, they are one and the same. Anything that happens to the business directly affects the owner, and the owner can sell his properties to save his business, or can even sell his properties to settle debts that was incurred in the course of running the business. But it is not like that with a limited liability company. And then number 6. Before I go to number 6, recall that a company simply means a business that has a legal status. So that has come into play here. A private limited liability company in the same vein means that it has a status that is different from its owner, meaning that the company can sue you to court if there are misdoings against it. And in turn, you can also sue the company to court. The company is different from the owner. The owners are the shareholders. They can be sleeping at their homes, not necessarily knowing what is going on with their business. Not necessarily knowing what is going on with the business. The business can defend itself in court, can appear before the magistrate or the judge and so on, without the shareholders coming to court. And then there is continuity of business at the death or withdrawal of a shareholder. There is continuity of business. What this simply means is that if a shareholder dies or withdraws from the company will still function. The company will still do business. It will not fold up. It will not fold up because the absence of one or two persons has no significant impact on the existence of that business. And of course, the shares of the person that pulled out can be sold to another person. So this is why, or can be transferred to another person. This is why continuity is an essential feature of a limited liability company. And then the company is managed by board of directors appointed by the shareholders. In a limited liability company, the owners are separate from the managers, those that run the business. The owners of the business, which are the shareholders, pay people to manage or run this business for them. and that is why they can afford to sleep in their homes. And then number 8, shares are not easily transferable in a private limited liability company. Shares are transferable but not easily transferable because of the protocols, because of the cumbersome processes, because of restrictions that has been placed by its articles. I hope we have understood up to that point. Now that we are done with the features of private limited liability companies, let us also look at the features of public limited liability companies. So we are now looking at the features of public limited liability companies. The first feature or characteristics is that the number of shareholders range from 7 to infinity. Minimum of 7 persons and maximum of infinity. And then number 2, it is a legal entity. It is a legal entity just like the private limited liability company. The business can sue someone to court and someone can also sue the business to court without having anything to do with the owners of the business, that is the shareholders. And then number 3, public limited liability companies enjoy perpetual existence. In other words, the business can continue to exist just like the private limited liability company, even at the death of a shareholder. Number 4, it has limited liability of shareholders. The shareholders of that business, their liability is restricted to the amount of shares they have in their business. They have nothing to do with their properties in settlement of the company's debt should the company fold up or run into trouble. And then number 5, they prepare, audit and publish accounts annually. At the end of every accounting year, the company is expected to make its accounts available, published, so that those that need its accounting information can make use of it, ranging from the shareholders even up to the government. And then number 6, the ownership is separated from management. Those that run the business, like I said earlier, in private limited liability companies, are different from those that own the business. The owners of the business are the shareholders, while the board of directors are those that run or manage the business. Then number 7, shares are easily transferable in a public limited liability company. It is not like the private limited liability company where the process of transferring shares are cumbersome, where there are so many restrictions. Okay, that is it for features. Now we are going to look at sources of capital or sources of finance for limited liability companies in general. We are going to be starting with private limited liability companies. What are the ways through which private limited liability companies get monies to run their business? Number 1, they get loans and overdraft from banks. The banks make loan facilities available for companies at any time they call. And then number 2, shares raised by shareholders. Of course, the shareholders all have shares for them to be members or owners of a private limited liability company. From those number of shares which they have paid for, the company has some funds to run the business. And then number 3, leasing of equipment. Leasing of equipment. The company usually gives out its equipment on lease to third parties, to people who in turn pay. So they raise fundings from there. And then number 4, the reinvestment of profits made by the company back into the business. In other words, plowing back of profits. Plowing back of profits. Sometimes the shareholders may decide not to share the profits but reinvest it back into the business either to expand it or to take advantage of other potential business opportunities. And then number 5, trade credit. The company can decide to get raw materials on credit so that at the end of the day they can pay later. Then number 6, hire purchase. Sometimes a company may not be able to pay for certain equipment or certain facilities. These facilities may be supplied to that company on hire purchase. Hire purchase is an arrangement in which the company pays instrumentally until the property is fully paid for and acquired by the company. So these are the ways they get to run or fund their business. Now let's look at the sources of capital for public limited liability companies. In a similar way, the public limited liability companies used to go to the banks for loans and overdrafts. 2, because there is no restriction in selling their shares, they can easily sell their shares to acquire additional capital. They sell these shares to members of the public. In the same vein, they also sell debentures. They also sell debentures to members of the public to raise additional capital to run their business. Debentures, of course, is a kind of long-term loan instrument where interests are paid at a fixed rate. A fixed rate of interest is being paid to debenture holders, that is those that have bought debentures with the company. Just like banks give out loans and at the end of the day they get interest. It's the same way the companies give out debentures for sales and the members of the public that buys these debentures become debenture holders. In other words, they become creditors to the company. Just like the company sells shares and the people that buy these shares become shareholders, co-owners of the company, entitled to the profits made by the company. The difference is that debenture holders are not co-owners like the shareholders, but they are the creditors. They are the people that gave loan to the company and they are entitled to fixed amount of interest as the company makes profit. That's the difference. And then another way they get funding is through equipment leasing. I had explained that in private. Through retained or plowback profits. I had explained that in private. Through trade credit and hire purchase, which I have already explained in private limited liability companies. So now we are going to look at advantages and disadvantages of limited liability companies. And as usual, we are going to start with the private limited liability companies. So you take down the notes as we proceed. Okay, let's start with the advantages of private limited liability companies. Don't be confused by the acronym. Okay, number 1, large capital. Because a private limited liability company can have up to 50 number of shareholders. It means the capital is larger than what we would have obtained from a sole proprietorship or partnership. And then number 2, it has a legal entity, like I had explained earlier. The business is distinct from its owners. So there are no complications at all. The owners can have a quiet time resting while the business is running. The business can take care of itself and the owners will just go about their own normal affairs, private affairs. And then number 3, shareholders have limited liability. In the same vein, shareholders do not need to worry whether the failure of the business will affect their personal property, because they have a limited responsibility towards that business. They don't need to go and sell anything that they have to save their business. It is only limited to the number of shares they have in that company. And then number 4, there is continuity of existence, which I had explained earlier. And there is efficiency in management because the management is separated from the owners. The owners appoint those that manage the business. They pay them. They are like employees that are paid to manage the business effectively. And then number 6, large profit. Of course, large capital also translates to large profits. And then number 7, possibility of expansion. In the same vein, large capital, meaning large funding, will always make the expansion of the business possible. Now let's look at the disadvantages of private limited liability companies. The first disadvantage is that there is limited capital as well. Even when there is large capital, there is a possibility of a large capital due to the number of shareholders. But why is capital limited here? Capital is limited as a result of shares restrictions. Since the company cannot give its shares out for subscription to members of the public, these can limit the capital inflow that would have helped the business to expand as desired. And then number 2, lack of business privacy. Why is the business lacking in privacy of its operations? Because the business, like other companies, is expected to publish its accounts annually. It's not a secret. The account has to come to public awareness. And then number 3, shares are not easily transferable. Some of the shares restrictions I talked about. Number 4, lack of personal contact with employees and customers. Shareholders do not come to the business premises to run or manage the business. So the business owners have no personal relationship with who the customers are or who is working for them. And then number 5, payment of corporate tax. Most companies suffer payment of this tax because this tax is usually huge. The government usually tax companies in such a way that is very, very huge. And then number 6, there is delay in decision making. There is delay in decision making because the owners are many, their views and opinions may disagree with that of one another, and so they may not pass decisions quickly or timely to help the business grow as it should. And then we also want to look at the advantages of public limited liability. Advantages of public limited liability company. Number 1, it has legal entity, which I had already explained. There is perpetual existence. The business continues to exist even without a shareholder. Number 3, there is limited liability of shareholders, which I have already explained. There is larger capital since shares are sold to members of the public. The public limited liability company have easy access to loan from the banks because banks prefer to give them loans as compared to other business outfits. Then number 6, there is democracy in management. Many hands are involved, so they usually deliberate on the best management decisions to take in running the business. And then number 7, they usually carry out research programs and they also recruit experts to manage and run the business. On the disadvantage side, there is lack of business privacy, which I had already explained in private limited liability company. There is conflict of interest among shareholders, and because of this conflict of interest, decision making becomes slow. And then there is separation of owners from control of the management. Since it is not the owners that manage the business directly, they may not be able to do what they have in their own minds concerning the business. And then it is a business outfit that is complicated and hard to establish because of the bureaucratic processes that have to be followed. And then there is payment of large corporate tax. Taxation is a problem because the tax is usually heavy, and then there is large capital required to set up and run the business. Before we go, I would like you to take the assignment on the board. Make sure you do these assignments and get them across to me, please. I'll be glad to mark them and return to you. Until then, remain safe till we meet again.